The conference room on the 22nd floor of Reyes Creative Agency hummed with the kind of anticipation that comes right before someone's world shifts. Victoria Reyes stood at the head of the polished oak table, her charcoal Armani suit catching the late September sunlight that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lower Manhattan. 180 employees had crammed into the space and the overflow hallway, their faces reflecting everything from genuine excitement to barely concealed skepticism. Her fingers brushed the small remote in her palm, the presentation screen behind her displaying the company logo she'd designed 13 years ago in a studio apartment in Queens with nothing but a pirated copy of Illustrator and a dream that felt too big for her body to contain. Now that logo represented $42 million in annual revenue, partnerships with Fortune 500 companies, and a reputation built on one principle she'd learned from her father, who spent 40 years mopping floors in office buildings across the city. Integrity wasn't negotiable, even when the cost felt unbearable, especially then. Victoria's throat tightened as she clicked to the next slide. The title read, New Leadership Announcement, in the custom typeface Daniel had designed 3 months ago. Back when he was just another talented designer trying to prove he belonged in a room full of people who'd attended schools he couldn't afford and networked at clubs that wouldn't have let him through the door. I want to introduce our new Chief Creative Officer, Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced calm she'd perfected in boardrooms where she was often the only woman, the only person of color, the only one who remembered what it felt like to choose between paying rent and eating 3 meals a day. Someone who in 6 months has brought in $8.2 million in new revenue, whose Reclaimed Roots campaign for Stellar Eco became a case study at Parsons, and whose vision for ethical design has elevated everything we create. The door at the back of the conference room opened. Daniel Brooks stepped through, and Victoria's heart performed the same complicated dance it had been doing since the day she watched him fix her car in a rainstorm, sacrificing everything he needed for someone he'd never met. He wore a tailored navy suit that actually fit his frame, no longer the borrowed clothes that hung slightly wrong, or the thrift store finds he'd stretched across 3 years of interviews and rejections. His close-cropped hair was freshly cut, his dark skin catching the light as he walked with the kind of quiet dignity that had first caught her attention when she'd watched him teach teenagers at the Bronx Youth Center, showing them how design could give voice to stories the world tried to silence. But it was his eyes that held her, warm brown depths that had seen too much loss for 34 years, that carried the weight of raising a daughter alone while fighting a system designed to keep him on the margins, that somehow still held enough hope to believe love could survive the gauntlet of public scrutiny and corporate politics. Their gazes met across the room. 180 people faded into background noise. For a moment, Victoria was back in that coffee shop in Brooklyn 3 months ago, sitting across from a man she'd just met but somehow already knew, listening to him explain why he'd stopped to help a stranger even when it cost him everything he'd been working toward. The applause started slowly. Marcus Liu, the art director who'd become Daniel's fiercest advocate, stood first, clapping with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from watching genuine talent get the recognition it deserves. The younger designers joined in, the ones who'd worked alongside Daniel and seen firsthand how he transformed client visions into something that didn't just sell products but told stories worth hearing. But Victoria also saw the faces that remained still. The older guard, the ones who'd been with the company since the early days, the ones who'd absorbed the same unspoken rules about who belonged in leadership and who didn't. Their expressions ranged from polite masks to barely concealed disapproval, and Victoria knew exactly what they were thinking because she'd heard it whispered in break rooms and seen it typed in anonymous comments on industry forums. He's only here because he's sleeping with the boss. She earned her position. He slept his way into his. Affirmative action at its finest. Daniel reached the front of the room, standing beside Victoria with the kind of presence that came from years of being underestimated and learning to let his work speak louder than anyone's prejudices. He didn't smile at the applause. He simply nodded, acknowledging the recognition without claiming more than he'd earned, and Victoria loved him more for that restraint. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when presenting to clients who'd initially questioned why the CEO had assigned a black designer to their luxury brand campaign, right before his concept tripled their projected engagement. "3 months ago, I walked into this building soaking wet, covered in grease from fixing a stranger's car, and missed the interview I'd been preparing for like my life depended on it. Because it did." The room went silent. Victoria's pulse quickened. They'd discussed this speech, agreed on the narrative they'd present to the company, the careful balance between honesty and the privacy they'd fought so hard to protect. But Daniel was veering off script, and she could only trust that he knew what he was doing. "I didn't know the woman I helped was Victoria Reyes," Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces, meeting skepticism with unwavering directness. "I didn't know she was the CEO of the company I was trying to join. I just knew she needed help, and my father taught me that character is what you do when nobody's watching, when there's no reward coming, when it costs you something you can't afford to lose." Daniel's fingers flexed at his sides, the only tell that he was nervous. Victoria resisted the urge to reach for his hand, to offer the reassurance they gave each other in private, but couldn't display in this room without feeding every assumption about favoritism and special treatment. "I earned this position," Daniel said, and his voice hardened with the kind of steel that comes from having to prove yourself every single day, from knowing that your mistakes will be magnified while your victories get diminished. The Reclaimed Roots campaign brought in $2.4 million from a client who almost walked because they didn't think I understood their sophisticated aesthetic. The Bronx Youth Center rebrand I did pro bono got picked up by the New York Times. The sustainable packaging redesign for Greenleaf reduced their production costs by 32%, while increasing shelf appeal. He paused, letting the numbers settle over a room full of people who respected data even when they questioned motives. Victoria watched Marcus nod, watched Sarah Chen from the UI team lean forward with interest, watched the skeptical faces struggle to reconcile their assumptions with the evidence Daniel was laying out with the precision of someone who'd learned to document everything, because his word alone would never be enough. "I'm not asking you to like me," Daniel said. "I'm not asking you to approve of my relationship with Victoria. I'm asking you to judge my work. And if you find it lacking, tell me. I'll fix it. But if you find it exceptional, then give credit where it's earned, not where it's comfortable." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Then Sarah stood, her applause sharp and deliberate. Bobby Martinez joined her, Alexis from copywriting. One by one, the younger half of the company rose, their ovation genuine and sustained. The older guard remained seated, but Victoria saw something shift in a few faces. Not acceptance, not yet, but the recognition that Daniel had just made it much harder to dismiss him as a diversity hire who'd charmed his way into the boss's bed and a corner office. As the applause faded and employees filtered back to their desks, Victoria caught the eye of Patricia Lang, the HR director whose office had become a second home over the past 3 months as they navigated the minefield of workplace relationships and public perception. Patricia's expression was unreadable, but she tilted her head toward her office in a silent summons that Victoria knew meant another conversation about optics and liability and all the ways their relationship could still blow up in everyone's faces. But for now, Victoria allowed herself a moment of gratitude. Daniel had his promotion. She had this man she loved standing beside her, earning respect one skeptic at a time. And Maya, Daniel's 8-year-old daughter with the gap-toothed smile and questions bigger than the sky, had stopped asking when Victoria was going to leave like everyone else in her young life seemed to do. It wasn't perfect. It was barely stable. But it was theirs, built on a foundation of choices made in rainstorms and coffee shops and late nights when the weight of other people's judgment felt too heavy to carry. The screen behind them still displayed Daniel's title, Chief Creative Officer. Victoria clicked the remote, and the presentation advanced to the next slide, the one that showed their 6-month roadmap for the creative department. All the initiatives Daniel had proposed that would push the company toward more ethical design practices, more diverse vendor partnerships, more investment in emerging talent from communities that the industry had historically ignored. 3 months earlier, she'd stood in a different conference room, facing down a board of directors who'd demanded she choose between her company and her integrity. She'd chosen both, and the cost had been 2 board members resigning, a week of brutal press coverage, and enough sleepless nights to make her question everything except the man who'd proven that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting yourself from the consequences. Now that same man was walking toward the elevator, and Victoria followed, because they'd learned that the moments between public performance and private truth were where they found the strength to keep fighting. The elevator doors closed, leaving them alone in the chrome and mirror box that descended toward the lobby. Daniel leaned against the wall, exhaling the breath he'd been holding since walking into that conference room. Victoria wanted to touch him, to offer comfort, but the security camera in the corner reminded her that even their private moments weren't entirely their own. "You went off script," Victoria said, keeping her tone light, even though her heart was still racing from the risk he'd taken. Daniel's mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. "You hired me for my creative vision. That includes knowing when to improvise. And did your creative vision account for the fact that half the room still thinks you're here because of who you're sleeping with?" The almost smile faded. Daniel's jaw tightened, and Victoria saw the flash of pain that he tried so hard to hide. The accumulated weight of every dismissive comment, every knowing look, every assumption that his talent was secondary to their relationship. "I know what they think," Daniel said quietly. "I hear it in the break room when they don't realize I'm in the supply closet. I see it in the way some clients ask if Marcus is available instead when they're assigned to me. I read it in the industry forums where people who've never seen my portfolio debate whether I've earned my position." The elevator slowed, the digital display counting down floors. Victoria's reflection in the mirror showed a woman who'd built an empire on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else, anticipating problems and neutralizing them before they became crises. But she hadn't anticipated how much it would cost the man she loved to be seen as her weakness instead of her equal. "I'm sorry," Victoria began, but Daniel shook his head. "Don't. I didn't fight my way here to have you apologize for giving me a chance. I just need to work twice as hard to prove I belong, which is the same standard I've been held to my entire life. The only difference now is the stakes are higher and the audience is bigger." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened to reveal the sleek, minimalist space that Victoria had spent a fortune designing because she believed environments shaped creativity, and she wanted her employees to walk into a place that felt like possibility instead of constraint. Daniel stepped out first, his posture straightening as he transitioned back into the role of Chief Creative Officer, the armor of professionalism sliding into place. Victoria followed, maintaining the careful distance between them that HR had recommended, the 3 feet of space that supposedly protected them from accusations of inappropriate workplace conduct. It felt like a chasm. Her phone buzzed, a text from Patricia. "My office, 20 minutes. We need to talk about the board meeting next week." Another text, this one from an unknown number. "Saw the announcement. How much is he paying you to ruin your reputation? Or is the BBC really that good?" Victoria deleted the message without responding. She'd learned that engaging with anonymous cruelty only fed it, that the internet was full of people who mistook their bitterness for insight. But the words still left a residue, a reminder that no matter how successful she became, There would always be someone ready to reduce her accomplishments to her body, her choices, her refusal to stay within the lines that society drew for women who looked like her and dared to want everything. Daniel's phone buzzed too. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening in a way that told Victoria it was another message he wouldn't share, another attack he'd absorb alone because he'd spent 8 years protecting his daughter from the cruelty of the world, and old habits died hard. Maya's babysitter canceled, Daniel said, pocketing his phone. I need to leave early to pick her up from school. Victoria checked her watch. 2:15. The board prep meeting with Patricia wouldn't end until at least 5, which meant she'd miss seeing Maya today, miss the evening ritual they'd been building where Daniel cooked dinner while Victoria helped Maya with her science homework and tried not to feel the weight of being a stand-in for a mother who'd died before Victoria ever had the chance to meet her. Tell her I said hi, Victoria said, and hated how formal it sounded, how the careful distance they maintained at work bled into their personal lives, until sometimes she couldn't remember how to just be with him without calculating the optics. Daniel nodded, already moving toward the exit, already shifting from chief creative officer to single father, the role he'd been playing since Sarah died of cancer 3 years ago and left him alone with a 5-year-old who asked questions about heaven and a mortgage he couldn't afford, and grief that never quite healed. Victoria watched him go, watched the afternoon sunlight catch on his shoulders as he pushed through the glass doors, watched him check his phone again and saw his jaw clench at whatever message he'd received. She wanted to run after him, to stand beside him against whatever fresh assault the internet had delivered, to remind him that she'd chosen him in a room full of board members who'd threatened her career, and she'd choose him again every single day. But Patricia was waiting. The board meeting next week would determine whether the company's investors believed in Victoria's judgment or demanded changes that would force impossible choices. And somewhere in the Bronx, Maya was waiting for her father to pick her up from school, to make her the pancakes he'd perfected over 3 years of being both mother and father, to tell her that the woman who'd been coming to dinner 3 nights a week wasn't leaving like her mother had left, even though nobody could promise that kind of certainty in a world where cancer killed young mothers and strangers on the internet sent death threats to CEOs who dared to love black men. Victoria turned toward the elevator that would take her back to the 22nd floor, back to Patricia's office and the conversation about damage control and brand protection, and all the ways their relationship was being weaponized against the company she'd built from nothing. Her heels clicked against marble floors, each step a reminder of how far she'd climbed and how much further she could fall. The elevator was crowded this time. Junior designers headed back from late lunch breaks, account managers comparing notes on client calls, the everyday business of a company that had grown beyond what she'd imagined possible when she'd maxed out her credit cards to hire her first employee. They all nodded respectfully, but Victoria saw the calculation in their eyes, the same question everyone was asking. How long until the relationship implodes and takes the company down with it? She'd asked herself the same question at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come and the weight of responsibility felt crushing. She'd asked it the day the New York Times ran a piece titled "Love or Liability? Victoria Reyes Navigates Romance in the C-Suite," complete with quotes from workplace ethics experts who'd never met her or Daniel, but had plenty of opinions about the optics of interracial relationships between bosses and employees. She'd asked it every time Maya looked at her with those big brown eyes and asked if Victoria was going to be her new mom, and every time Daniel flinched at the question because he was terrified of promising his daughter something that might not survive the pressure they were under. But she'd never asked it when she was actually with Daniel. When they were alone in her apartment after Maya was asleep, when he cooked her the Puerto Rican dishes his grandmother had taught him and told her stories about growing up in the Bronx and dreaming of being an artist in a neighborhood where survival was the only art most people had time for. When she showed him the sketches she'd made in the Bronx Youth Center when she was 13 and a volunteer designer had taught her Photoshop and changed the trajectory of her entire life. when they stayed up until 2 in the morning redesigning her company's diversity initiatives because they both knew that their relationship meant nothing if it didn't open doors for the next person, fighting their way up from circumstances that weren't designed to let them win. Patricia's office door was open. The HR director sat behind her desk, her silver hair pulled back in the same efficient bun she'd worn every day for the 7 years she'd been with Reyes Creative. Patricia had been Victoria's first real hire after the company grew beyond what she could manage alone. A veteran HR professional who'd left a corporate law firm because she'd grown tired of protecting companies from the consequences of their own discrimination. She'd joined Reyes Creative because Victoria had promised her something rare, a chance to build a company culture from scratch, one that actually valued integrity over liability mitigation. But even Patricia's considerable expertise was being tested by a relationship that defied every conventional wisdom about workplace romance, power dynamics, and the optics of a Latina CEO dating a black employee she'd personally hired. "Close the door," Patricia said, and Victoria's stomach tightened because those 3 words had preceded every difficult conversation they'd had over the past 3 months. Victoria sat in the leather chair across from Patricia's desk, the same chair where she'd sat when Patricia had first told her about the anonymous complaint filed the week after Victoria and Daniel had gone public with their relationship. The complaint had alleged favoritism, inappropriate use of company resources, and a hostile work environment created by the perception that romantic involvement with the CEO was a path to advancement. The investigation had cleared them of everything except the appearance of impropriety, which couldn't be legislated away, but hung over them like weather that never quite broke into storm or sun. Patricia slid a manila folder across the desk. "Mitchell Thornton has been running a coordinated harassment campaign. We traced the posts back to his IP address." Victoria's hands tightened. Mitchell, the board member who'd resigned 3 months ago, was now actively trying to destroy her company. What are our options?" Victoria asked. "Of your relationship with Daniel. He's positioning himself as the stable alternative, the one who warned you this would happen." Victoria stood, needing to move, needing to do something with the anger that flooded her system. She walked to Patricia's window, looking out over Lower Manhattan, over the city that had given her everything and demanded even more in return. 3 months ago, she'd stood in a boardroom on the 40th floor and listened to Mitchell Thornton explain why her relationship with Daniel was a liability the company couldn't afford. He'd used words like optics and stakeholder confidence and fiduciary responsibility, but Victoria had heard what he really meant. A Latina CEO dating a black employee was too threatening to the comfortable narrative of how power was supposed to look. She'd told him to resign or accept her decision. He'd resigned, taking Gerald Fitzpatrick with him, reducing her 7-member board to 5, and making every subsequent vote that much more precarious. Now he was coming after her company, using her relationship as the weapon he'd predicted it would become. "What are our options?" Victoria asked, keeping her voice level even though she wanted to scream. Patricia stood, moving to stand beside her at the window. The city stretched out below them, millions of people navigating their own complicated lives, fighting their own battles against systems that weren't designed to accommodate their humanity. "Legally, we can pursue defamation claims if we can prove the statements are false and causing measurable harm," Patricia said. "But that draws more attention to the issue and makes you look defensive. We could issue a public statement reaffirming the company's anti-retaliation policies and Daniel's qualifications, but that might come across as protesting too much." "Or?" Victoria asked because she could hear the hesitation in Patricia's voice, the option she was reluctant to suggest. "Or you end the relationship. Publicly. Cite the pressure it's putting on the company. Position it as a difficult but necessary choice for the good of your employees and stakeholders. Victoria's reflection in the window stared back at her. She looked like the kind of woman who made difficult choices for the good of her company every day. She'd laid off employees during the recession. She'd walked away from lucrative contracts that would have compromised her values. She'd built Reyes Creative on the principle that sometimes the right choice was the expensive one, and you made it anyway because integrity compounded over time in ways that shortcuts never did. But ending her relationship with Daniel wasn't a difficult choice. It was an impossible one. Because she'd already chosen him in that boardroom 3 months ago, already calculated the cost and decided he was worth it, already looked into his eyes and promised she wouldn't let the weight of other people's prejudices crush what they were building together. "No," Victoria said. Patricia nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. "Then we fight. We document everything Mitchell is doing, build a case that he's engaged in a targeted campaign to harm the company because you rejected his attempt to control your personal life. We go to the remaining board members before the meeting next week and show them the evidence. We make it clear that the choice isn't between you and stability. It's between integrity and letting a vindictive former board member manipulate them through fear. And if they don't believe us? If they decide Mitchell is right and the company can't survive the scrutiny?" Patricia's expression softened. "Then you'll have to decide what you're willing to lose, the company you built or the man you love, because Mitchell is going to force that choice, and he's betting you'll sacrifice Daniel to save Reyes Creative." Victoria's phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. "Maya wants to know if you're coming to dinner. She made you a card." Another text, a photo attached, Maya holding up a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun that took up half the page. The figures were labeled Daddy, Maya, and Tori in Maya's careful 8-year-old handwriting. Victoria's throat tightened. She'd never wanted children of her own. Her marriage to Richard had ended partly because she'd chosen to build a company instead of a family, had refused to apologize for ambition that made him feel small. But Maya had slipped past every defense Victoria had built, with her gap-toothed smile and her questions about whether Victoria would teach her to draw like her daddy and her absolute certainty that love was simple even when adults made it complicated. She texted back, "Board meeting running late. Save me some pancakes. Tell Maya I loved the card." Daniel's response came quickly. "She says pancakes are better fresh. Can you make it by 7? Victoria checked her watch. 5:45. If she left now, skipped the rest of her prep with Patricia, prioritized dinner with Daniel and Maya over the strategic planning that might save her company, she could make it to Daniel's apartment in the Bronx by 7. But Patricia was looking at her with an expression that said there was more, that the manila folder full of screenshots wasn't the only crisis demanding Victoria's attention. "What else?" Victoria asked. Patricia returned to her desk, pulling out a second folder, this one thinner but somehow heavier with implication. "The SEC is asking questions about our hiring practices, specifically about whether Daniel's rapid advancement represents a pattern of favoritism that could indicate broader governance issues." Victoria felt the world tilt. The Securities and Exchange Commission didn't ask casual questions. They investigated, they audited. They had the power to find problems even when none existed, because in a system built on the presumption that relationships between powerful women and less powerful men must involve coercion or corruption, love itself became suspicious. "We've done everything by the book," Victoria said. "Daniel reports to Marcus, not to me. I've recused myself from his performance reviews. We've documented every decision, every promotion, every raise." "I know, but Mitchell knows that too, which is why he's escalating. He can't prove you've done anything wrong, so he's making sure the investigation itself becomes the punishment. Because even if the SEC finds nothing, the fact that they investigated creates a cloud over the company. Investors get nervous. Clients start asking questions. Employees wonder if their leadership is focused on running a business or managing a scandal. Victoria sank back into the chair, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. She'd built Reyes Creative over 13 years of 18-hour days and sleeping in her office and saying no to everything except the work and the vision and the belief that a woman who'd grown up watching her father mop floors could create something that mattered. And now a vindictive former board member was using her relationship with a good man as a weapon to tear it all down. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Daniel. Maya's asking if you're okay. I told her you're working, but she says you have a sad emoji face. Her words. Victoria looked at the time. 6:15. If she left right now, she'd hit rush hour traffic. If she stayed to finish planning their response to Mitchell's campaign, she'd miss dinner with Maya, would see the disappointment in Daniel's eyes when he opened the door at 9 or 10, or whenever she finally made it to his apartment with takeout that had gone cold and apologies that felt increasingly hollow. She typed, "Tell Maya I'm okay. Just busy. I'll be there by 8. Promise." Patricia was watching her with the expression of someone who'd seen this movie before, who knew how it ended for women who tried to have both the corner office and the family dinner, who'd watched too many talented women sacrifice themselves on the altar of impossible choices. "Go," Patricia said. "Maya made you a card. That matters more than anything we're going to strategize tonight. The board meeting is in 5 days. And we have 4 more days to prepare. Go have dinner with your family." The word hit Victoria like a physical thing. Family. She'd spent so long building a company that the idea of building anything else had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But somewhere in the past 3 months, between teaching Maya about color theory and watching Daniel cook sofrito in her kitchen, and learning that love didn't make you weaker if you were brave enough to let it make you stronger, she'd stumbled into something that felt like family. And Mitchell Thornton was betting she'd sacrifice it to save her company. Victoria stood, gathering her things. "Send me everything you have on Mitchell's campaign. I'll review it tonight after Maya goes to sleep. And start documenting our compliance with every SEC regulation on hiring and promotion. If they want to investigate, we'll show them a company that's so clean it squeaks." Patricia nodded, but Victoria saw the concern in her eyes, the unspoken question about how long someone could fight on multiple fronts before something gave. The elevator ride down felt longer this time. Victoria's reflection in the chrome walls looked tired, the careful makeup no longer quite hiding the strain of 3 months spent proving that her judgment was sound, that Daniel had earned every opportunity she'd given him, that loving him didn't make her weak or compromised or any of the things the internet seemed certain it proved. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "TikTok Victoria, board meeting in 5 days. Wonder what they'll decide when they see just how bad this is for business. Enjoy your ghetto boyfriend while you can." Victoria deleted it. But the words lingered, poisonous and calculated to hit every insecurity she'd ever had about whether she deserved what she'd built, whether loving Daniel made her selfish, whether she was putting her own happiness ahead of the 180 employees who depended on Reyes Creative for their livelihoods. She stepped out into the September evening, the air still warm but carrying the first hint of autumn's approach. The city moved around her with the chaotic energy that had always felt like home. Millions of people pursuing their own complicated dreams in a place that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. Victoria's driver was waiting, but she waved him off. She needed the subway ride to the Bronx, needed the 40 minutes of anonymity where she was just another woman in a business suit heading home after a long day. Needed to remember who she'd been before she became the CEO everyone had an opinion about. The 6 train was crowded. Victoria squeezed in between a nurse still wearing scrubs and a construction worker with concrete dust on his boots. Nobody recognized her. Nobody cared that she ran a $42 million company, or that her relationship was being dissected by strangers on the internet, or that in 5 days she might have to choose between everything she'd built and everyone she loved. She was just another person trying to make it home before the people waiting for her gave up hope that she was coming. The train lurched forward. Victoria gripped the pole and thought about 3 months ago, when everything had been simpler, when Daniel had been just another candidate she'd scheduled for an interview, when she hadn't known that the man who'd fixed her car in a rainstorm would become the person she called when the weight of running a company felt too heavy to carry alone. When she hadn't known that love could be this complicated, this scrutinized, this worth fighting for even when the cost kept climbing and there was no guarantee they'd survive what was coming. Her phone buzzed one more time. Daniel. Maya set a place for you at the table. She's wearing the bracelet you made her. Hurry home. Hurry home. Victoria closed her eyes. In 4 days, she'd face the board. Mitchell had spent 3 months building his case, and she still didn't know if integrity would be enough. But tonight, Maya was waiting. Daniel had made pancakes, and that had to be enough for now. Victoria climbed the familiar stairs to 3C. Maya opened before she knocked. You made it before 8, Daniel observed, sliding a perfect golden pancake onto the growing stack. I'm impressed. Patricia usually keeps you until midnight when there's a crisis. There's always a crisis. Tonight I chose pancakes. Maya was already setting Victoria's place at the small dining table that doubled as Maya's homework station and Daniel's freelance workspace, back when freelance was all he could get. 3 plates, 3 sets of mismatched silverware, 3 glasses of orange juice poured with the kind of care that transformed a Tuesday night dinner into a ceremony worth showing up for. Victoria's phone buzzed. Another anonymous message, another threat disguised as concern, another reminder that the internet had opinions about who she loved and wasn't shy about sharing them. She silenced the phone and slipped it into her bag, because Maya was explaining the science project she'd started that afternoon, and some things deserved undivided attention. Mrs. Rodriguez says we have to pick a question that doesn't have an easy answer, Maya explained, arranging her silverware with the precision of someone who'd inherited her father's eye for design. So, I picked, why do people judge other people for loving each other when love is supposed to be good? Daniel's spatula clattered against the pan. Victoria felt her throat tighten. Maya looked between them with the kind of innocence that hadn't yet learned some questions were too big for third-grade science fairs. Baby girl, that's more philosophy than science, Daniel managed, recovering his composure with the ease of someone who'd been fielding difficult questions since Maya was old enough to ask why Mommy wasn't coming home from the hospital. But Mrs. Rodriguez says, science is about observing patterns and testing theories. And I observed that people say mean things about you and Tori on the internet even though you're happy together. So I want to test if the mean things are based on facts or just feelings. Victoria sat down heavily in the chair Maya had designated as hers 3 months ago, when dinners at Daniel's apartment had shifted from occasional to regular to the highlight of Victoria's week. She'd built a company. She'd negotiated contracts with executives who ate junior competitors for breakfast. But an 8-year-old had just articulated the central question Victoria had been avoiding because the answer was too painful to examine directly. Daniel brought the pancakes to the table, his expression caught between pride in his daughter's critical thinking and concern about what happened when children tried to apply logic to systems built on illogic. Maya, honey, some things don't have good answers. Sometimes people are mean because they're scared or hurt or they learned the wrong lessons about who deserves happiness. Maya considered this while pouring syrup with the concentration of a surgeon. But you teach me that when something is wrong, we should try to fix it. You and Tori are trying to fix how companies hire people. Why can't we fix how people think about love? Victoria reached across the table, covering Maya's small hand with her own. The bracelet caught the light again, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall, and Victoria thought about how this child had somehow learned to find beauty in broken things, to transform wire and beads into something worth wearing. We can try. But fixing how people think takes longer than fixing hiring practices. and it hurts more along the way." Maya nodded, processing this with the seriousness of someone much older. Then she brightened. "That's okay. Daddy says important things are worth doing even when they're hard. That's why he helped you with your car, even though he missed his interview. Because helping people is more important than protecting yourself." Daniel's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't swallow. Victoria felt the weight of it. The way his choice that rainy morning in September had become the foundation story they were building their lives on. The proof that character mattered and kindness counted and doing the right thing would somehow be rewarded even when the evidence suggested the universe didn't work that way. They ate pancakes while Maya narrated her day with the kind of detail that made 10 minutes of recess sound like an epic adventure. She'd helped a new student find the bathroom. She'd scored highest on the math quiz. She'd stood up to Tyler Morrison when he'd said her daddy's job was fake because real designers worked for white people. Victoria's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "What did you say to Tyler?" Maya shrugged with the casual confidence of a child who'd been raised to believe her worth wasn't up for debate. "I said my daddy is chief creative officer at Reyes Creative Agency, and he earned it by being the best designer they could find. Then I showed him the article about the Reclaimed Roots campaign on my tablet. Tyler said it was cool." Daniel was staring at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. This fierce small person who'd learned to defend him with facts and evidence because she'd watched him defend himself the same way every single day. "I'm proud of you, baby girl. But you know you don't have to fight my battles. You fight for me all the time, when the teacher said I should be in the slower math group because I daydream. When that lady at the store followed us around like we were going to steal something. When you work extra hours so I can have new shoes and art supplies and dance classes." Maya's voice wavered on the last words, and Victoria saw Daniel's carefully maintained composure crack just enough to reveal the man underneath, the one who'd been holding it together for 3 years of single parenthood and wasn't sure how much longer he could keep all the pieces in place. "That's different. I'm the parent. It's my job to protect you. And it's my job to protect you back. Because family means everyone takes care of everyone." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them had explicitly discussed. Family. Not Daniel and Maya, plus the woman who came to dinner. Not a CEO dating her employee with his kid as complicated baggage. Just family. Simple and complete and terrifying in its presumption that what they were building would last. Victoria's phone buzzed again. She ignored it. Maya was explaining how she'd designed a survey for her science project, questions about what makes people uncomfortable about interracial relationships versus same-race relationships, about whether people thought it was wrong for bosses to date employees, or just wrong when the boss was a woman. She'd already collected 20 responses from her classmates, and the preliminary data suggested that kids didn't care about any of it until adults taught them to care. "That's really sophisticated research design, Maya," Victoria offered, falling into the role she'd carved out over 3 months of dinners and homework help and learning to be present in someone else's life. "Have you thought about how you'll present your findings?" "I'm going to make an infographic. Daddy's been teaching me about visual data representation." Of course he had, because Daniel couldn't help being an educator. Couldn't stop himself from sharing everything he knew with anyone curious enough to ask, which was why the teenagers at the Bronx Youth Center looked at him like he'd hung the moon, and why Maya was doing third-grade science projects that would challenge high school students. They cleared the table together, another choreography they'd perfected, Victoria washing while Daniel dried and Maya put away dishes in cabinets she could barely reach. The domestic rhythm felt like muscle memory, even though they'd only been doing it for a few months, like her body had been waiting for this all along and just needed permission to recognize it as home. Maya's bedtime was 8:30, a rule Daniel enforced with the consistency of someone who understood that structure was love made visible. Victoria had learned to time her visits around it, to be there for dinner, but gone before the nighttime routine that belonged to Daniel and Maya alone, the space where he read her stories and answered questions about why her mother had to die, and promised that tomorrow would be better, even when he had no way of guaranteeing it. But tonight, Maya planted herself in front of Victoria with a determination that suggested bedtime might be negotiable. "Will you read to me? Daddy reads the voices different than you do. I like having both." Victoria glanced at Daniel, who nodded with an expression that suggested this was a test they'd both been avoiding, and Maya had just decided they were ready for it. Maya's bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, but Daniel had made it feel expansive through careful design choices: shelves that climbed the walls to create vertical storage, a reading nook by the window where cushions and string lights transformed a radiator cover into a fortress. Sarah's picture sat on the nightstand, a young woman with Maya's smile and Daniel's eyes, frozen at 31 before cancer had other plans. Maya climbed into bed with a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time, a book Victoria had loved at the same age, when the idea of tesseracting across the universe had felt possible, and Mrs. Watsit's wisdom about the length of life mattering less than its quality had seemed like distant adult concerns instead of immediate personal truths. Victoria settled on the edge of the bed while Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. She began reading, falling into the rhythm of Madeleine L'Engle's prose, letting Meg Murray's journey wash over all three of them. Maya's eyes grew heavy halfway through the chapter, her breathing evening out into the deep pattern of sleep. But Victoria kept reading because Daniel was still listening, and the words felt important. "The fifth dimension is love," Victoria read softly, and felt the weight of that impossible truth settle over them like a blanket. Daniel crossed to the bed, pulling Maya's covers up and pressing a kiss to her forehead with the tenderness of someone who'd been both mother and father for so long he'd forgotten there was supposed to be a difference. He motioned for Victoria to follow him out, clicking off the light and leaving the door cracked exactly 3 inches, the precise distance Maya had declared let in enough hallway light to keep the monsters away without keeping her awake. Back in the living room that was really just an extension of the kitchen, Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine from the bottle Victoria had brought last week, the mid-range Malbec that was the best she could bring without making him feel like she was trying to impress him with money he didn't have. They settled on the couch that Daniel had bought secondhand and reupholstered himself, their bodies finding the familiar configuration of her legs tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders, the position that let them pretend for a moment that the world outside this apartment wasn't actively trying to tear them apart. "She's asking for more," Daniel observed, his voice low enough not to carry to Maya's room. "I noticed. Are you ready for more? Because once we cross that line, once you become a permanent part of her bedtime routine and her science projects and her definition of family, there's no going back without breaking her heart." Victoria took a long drink of wine, using the time to formulate thoughts that felt too big for the small words available to contain them. She'd spent her adult life avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, the messy intimacy of other people's children and the vulnerability of being needed for more than her business acumen or her ability to solve problems with money and strategy. "I'm terrified," Victoria admitted. "I don't know how to be what she needs. I don't have a model for this. My mother worked 3 jobs and was too exhausted to read bedtime stories. I built a company instead of a family because that felt safer, more controllable." Daniel's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the ease of practice. "And now? Now I'm sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx drinking wine that costs $12 instead of working late at my office drinking scotch that costs $300. And I've never been happier, which terrifies me more than anything because happiness this profound can be taken away. Like Sarah." The name sat between them, the ghost Victoria had been carefully avoiding, even though Sarah's presence saturated every corner of this apartment. The woman who'd married Daniel right out of college, who'd given him Maya, and 3 more years before cancer had decided she'd had enough time. Who'd loved him first and best, and would always own a piece of his heart that Victoria could never claim. "I'm not trying to replace her," Victoria continued, needing to make this clear even though they'd danced around it for months. "I can't be Maya's mother. She had a mother. I can just be, you can be Tori, the person who shows up for dinner and helps with science projects and makes Maya feel like having more than one person who loves her doesn't diminish the love she had from the person she lost." Victoria's vision blurred. She blinked hard against the tears because crying felt like weakness, and she'd spent too many years in boardrooms to indulge in emotions that could be weaponized against her. Daniel's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching the single tear that escaped anyway. "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too. I'm terrified that I'm asking too much of you, that eventually the pressure will be too much, and you'll wake up one day and realize you signed up for a relationship but got a ready-made family with all the complications that entails. Is that what you think? That I'm here out of obligation? I think you're here because you have a good heart and you feel guilty about the circumstances of how we met, and you're trying to do the right thing, which is what you always do. But doing the right thing and choosing this life are different calculations." Victoria pulled back enough to look directly at him, to make sure he saw the truth in her eyes when she spoke. "I'm here because when I'm not here, I'm thinking about being here. I'm here because Maya makes me laugh and you make me feel seen, and this apartment feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived. I'm here because I choose to be, and I keep choosing it even when it costs me board members and media coverage and anonymous messages telling me I'm ruining my life." Daniel's expression shifted, the careful guardedness he wore like armor cracking just enough to reveal the hope underneath. "The board meeting is in 4 days. I know. Mitchell is going to make you choose. The company or me. He's been planning this for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to force your hand. He can plan all he wants. I already made my choice in that boardroom 3 months ago. I just need to make the board members understand that choosing you isn't choosing against the company. It's choosing the kind of leader I want to be." Daniel's laugh carried no humor. "A leader who dates her employees and promotes them to C-suite positions and has the SEC asking questions about whether it was all above board." Victoria stiffened. "How did you know about the SEC?" "Patricia sent me a heads up. Professional courtesy, since I'm the one whose hiring records they're going to scrutinize." Daniel stood, pacing the small living room with the restless energy of someone who'd been holding still too long. "This is my fault. I should have turned down the promotion, should have transferred to a different department or a different company entirely." "You earned that promotion." "Did I? Or did you give it to me because you loved me and wanted to prove that our relationship wouldn't affect my career, which ironically affected my career by making everyone question whether I would have gotten it otherwise?" The question landed like a physical blow. Victoria set down her wine glass before she did something unproductive like throwing it. "You brought in $8.2 million in new revenue in 6 months. You've transformed our approach to sustainable design. You've mentored 3 junior designers who were about to quit because they felt invisible. You've done everything I hired you to do, and more. And if we weren't together, would you still have promoted me? Or would you have played it safe, avoided the optics, kept me at senior designer for another year to make sure nobody could question your judgment?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond and found she didn't have an answer, because the truth was complicated. She'd promoted Daniel because he'd earned it, yes, but also because she'd wanted to prove that their relationship didn't compromise her professional judgment, that she could separate personal feelings from business decisions. And now Mitchell Thornton was using that very promotion as evidence that she couldn't be trusted to run a company without letting her heart override her head. "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "Maybe I would have waited. Maybe the optics would have mattered more if I didn't have something to prove." But that doesn't make the promotion unearned. It just makes the timing complicated. Complicated is one word for it. Career-destroying is another. Your career or mine? Daniel stopped pacing, turning to face her with an expression that made her chest ache. Both. Because if the SEC investigation finds even a hint of impropriety, it won't matter that you followed every protocol. It'll confirm what everyone already suspects, that I'm here because I'm sleeping with you, and you're too compromised by your feelings to see it. Victoria's phone buzzed again. This time she looked at it. Another text from Mitchell Thornton's fake account, another message designed to make her question everything. SEC is just the beginning. Wait until they audit your entire hiring history. How many other boyfriends did you slip into the company? She showed Daniel the message. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. He's trying to break you. Break us. I know. And it's working. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Victoria had built her company on the principle that integrity mattered more than expediency, that doing the right thing would always pay off in the long run, even when the short-term costs felt unbearable. But she'd never had to apply that principle to her personal life, had never tested whether integrity could survive the kind of systematic assault Mitchell was orchestrating. Daniel crossed to the couch, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. He took both her hands in his, and Victoria noticed the calluses on his palms from the years before he was a designer, when he'd worked construction and waited tables and done whatever it took to keep Maya fed and clothed. I love you, Daniel stated, and the words carried the weight of someone who didn't say them lightly. I love you enough to walk away if that's what it takes to protect what you've built. Victoria's grip tightened. Don't you dare. Don't you dare make this easier by offering to sacrifice yourself. That's not love. That's martyrdom. And I have enough Catholic guilt from my mother without you adding to it. Then what do we do? Because in 4 days you're walking into a board meeting where Mitchell has spent 3 months poisoning the well. Your investors are nervous. Your board members are questioning your judgment. And the SEC is investigating whether our relationship represents a pattern of corruption. We fight. We show the board exactly what Mitchell's been doing, the fake accounts, the coordinated harassment campaign, the targeted leaks to industry publications. We prove that the real threat to the company isn't our relationship. It's a vindictive former board member who can't handle being told no. Daniel shook his head. That makes you look defensive. It makes you look like you're deflecting from legitimate concerns about governance and leadership. Then what would you suggest? Because I'm open to ideas that don't involve ending our relationship or pretending you didn't earn your position. I suggest we get ahead of it. I suggest we commission an independent audit of every promotion, every raise, every hiring decision you've made in the past 3 years. We show the board that you're so confident in your integrity that you're willing to have it examined under a microscope. And if they find anything questionable, we address it head-on instead of waiting for the SEC to do it for us. Victoria considered this. It was a good strategy, the kind of preemptive transparency that could diffuse criticism before it gained momentum. But it was also terrifying, because opening your decisions to scrutiny meant accepting the possibility that someone would find fault, would identify the gray areas where judgment calls could be interpreted multiple ways, where doing your best might not be the same as doing it perfectly. That could take weeks. The board meeting is in 4 days. Then we propose it at the meeting. We show them we're not afraid of investigation because we have nothing to hide. We turn Mitchell's weapon into our shield. Victoria's phone buzzed. Patricia this time, with a message that made her blood run cold. Mitchell just leaked the SEC inquiry to TechCrunch. Story goes live in 2 hours. We need to prepare a response. She showed Daniel the message. He read it and stood, running both hands over his close-cropped hair in a gesture she'd learned meant he was processing information too quickly to articulate it clearly. He's escalating. He's not waiting for the board meeting. He's trying to create so much negative press that the board has no choice but to act. Victoria was already on her feet, already mentally shifting from the woman who'd read bedtime stories to Maya back into the CEO who'd built a company through calculated risk and strategic thinking. I need to get back to the office. Patricia and I need to craft a response before that story goes live. It's almost 10. Maya's asleep in the next room. You were supposed to stay. The accusation in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Victoria looked toward Maya's bedroom, toward the life she'd been trying to build alongside the company she'd already built, and felt the impossible weight of trying to be everything to everyone. I know, but if I don't respond to this tonight, by tomorrow morning the narrative will be set. Mitchell will control the story, and everything we've worked for will be framed through his version of events. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding even as disappointment crossed his features. Go. Do what you need to do. But Victoria? She paused at the door, her hand already on the knob. At some point, you're going to have to decide whether you're fighting for the company or fighting for us. Because Mitchell is betting they're mutually exclusive. And the more you prove him right by choosing board meetings and crisis management over showing up for the people who love you, the harder it gets to argue that you can actually have both. The words hit like accusations because they were true. Victoria had spent 3 months insisting that she could balance her relationship with Daniel and her responsibilities to Reyes Creative, that loving him didn't compromise her ability to lead, that she could show up for Maya's bedtime stories and board meetings and crisis management without sacrificing any of it. But standing in Daniel's doorway with her phone full of messages demanding her attention and a sleeping child in the next room who'd finally started calling her family, Victoria realized that balance might be a lie she'd been telling herself. That maybe Mitchell was right about one thing. You couldn't serve two masters, couldn't give everything to your company and your relationship, couldn't be CEO and partner and pseudo-parent without something breaking. The question was what she'd let break, and who would pay the price when it did. I'll call you after I deal with Patricia, Victoria managed, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Daniel crossed to her, pressing a kiss to her forehead with a tenderness that made her eyes burn. We'll be here. We're always here. But I need you to really think about whether that's enough. Because Maya's getting attached, and if you're going to choose the company over us, I need to know now before she gets hurt worse than she already has been. Victoria wanted to protest that it wasn't that simple, that she wasn't choosing anything over them, that the company and their relationship weren't competing interests but complementary parts of the life she was trying to build. But the words wouldn't come, because Daniel was right. Every time she left dinner early for a crisis call, every time she missed Maya's events because of board obligations, every time she put Reyes Creative's needs ahead of their growing family's needs, she was making a choice, and choices had consequences. She left the apartment without looking back, descended the 3 flights of stairs with her heels still in her hand, and emerged onto the Bronx street where the September night had turned cool enough to make her shiver. Her driver was waiting, having learned over 3 months that when Victoria came to Daniel's apartment, she usually left looking haunted. The drive back to Manhattan felt longer than it should have, the city lights blurring past while Victoria's mind raced through response strategies and damage control scenarios. Patricia had sent a draft statement for her review, carefully worded to acknowledge the SEC inquiry without admitting wrongdoing, to assert confidence in the company's hiring practices without sounding defensive, to thread the impossible needle between transparency and legal liability. But as Victoria read the statement, she realized it was missing the one thing that might actually matter: the truth. Not the careful legal truth that protected against liability, but the raw human truth about why she'd hired Daniel, why she'd promoted him, Why she was willing to risk everything she'd built for a relationship that made her feel more alive than any business success ever had. She texted Patricia. "The statement is fine, but it's not enough. We need to tell the actual story, not the sanitized version, the real one." Patricia's response came quickly. "That's a terrible idea from a legal standpoint. Every word becomes evidence if this goes to litigation." Victoria typed back, "Then let it be evidence. Let them see that I hired Daniel because he was talented, promoted him because he earned it, and fell in love with him because he's a good man who makes me want to be a better person. If that's a crime, I'd rather be guilty of honesty than innocent through careful phrasing." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "You're sure about this?" Victoria thought about Maya's science project, about the 8-year-old who'd decided to investigate why people judged her father for loving someone when love was supposed to be good. Thought about the survey Maya was conducting, the preliminary results that suggested children didn't care about race or power dynamics until adults taught them to care. Thought about Daniel's question, "Are you fighting for the company or fighting for us?" Maybe the answer was both. Maybe fighting for the right to love who she loved without sacrificing her professional credibility was the same as fighting for the kind of company she wanted to lead, one where integrity mattered more than optics, where doing the right thing counted for something even when it cost everything, where love wasn't a liability but a testament to character. "I'm sure," Victoria texted back. "Draft something honest. I'll review it when I get to the office." The car pulled up in front of Rhea's creative tower. Victoria climbed out, slipped her heels back on, and walked into the building she'd built from nothing. The security guard nodded respectfully. The elevator carried her to the 22nd floor. The lights in her office were still on because she'd learned years ago that leaving them on made the space feel less lonely when she worked late, which was most nights. Patricia was already there, laptop open, drafts scattered across the conference table. She looked up as Victoria entered, her expression caught between concern and resignation. "I drafted something honest," Patricia announced, turning her screen so Victoria could read. "It's going to make the lawyers very unhappy." Victoria read the statement Patricia had written and felt her throat tighten. "Rhea's creative agency has been informed of an SEC inquiry into our hiring and promotion practices. We welcome this investigation as an opportunity to demonstrate what we already know, that our decisions have been guided by merit, talent, and the belief that great design comes from diverse perspectives and inclusive practices." "Yes, I'm in a relationship with Daniel Brooks, our chief creative officer. Yes, I was the CEO who ultimately approved his hiring and subsequent promotion. And yes, I believe that loving him makes me a better leader, not a compromised one. Daniel Brooks earned every opportunity he's been given at this company. His portfolio speaks for itself. His client results speak for themselves. And if the price of integrity is investigation, then investigate. You'll find a company that's been built on the principle that doing the right thing matters more than protecting ourselves from scrutiny. We have nothing to hide. We have everything to prove. And we're ready to prove it." Victoria read it twice, feeling the weight of every word, the risk embedded in every sentence. This wasn't careful corporate speak designed to deflect criticism. This was a declaration of war, a refusal to play by rules that assumed relationships between powerful women and talented men must involve corruption or coercion. "It's perfect," Victoria decided. "Send it." Patricia's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "You understand what this means? You're not just defending your relationship. You're making it the story. You're betting everything that the public will respond to honesty more than they'll respond to the narrative Mitchell's been building. I'm betting that most people are decent, that they understand love doesn't follow corporate policy, that they're tired of women having to choose between personal happiness and professional success." Victoria paused. "And if I'm wrong, if the board fires me and the SEC finds violations and Mitchell wins, At least I'll lose knowing I didn't compromise who I am to protect what I've built." Patricia nodded slowly, then hit send. The statement went live on the company blog, was automatically pushed to their social media channels, landed in the inboxes of every major tech publication and business journalist who covered the industry. Within minutes, Victoria's phone exploded. Messages from board members demanding to know what she was thinking. Texts from employees expressing support or concern or confusion. Emails from journalists wanting interviews, comments, reactions to her unprecedented decision to address a federal investigation with radical transparency. And one text from Daniel. "I saw the statement. I love you. Come back when you can. Maya left the porch light on for you." Victoria stared at that last sentence, at the image of an 8-year-old girl leaving a light on like breadcrumbs to guide someone home, like hope made visible, like a child's absolute certainty that people who said they'd come back actually would. Patricia was watching her with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what Victoria was thinking. "Go home," Patricia ordered quietly. "There's nothing more we can do tonight. The statement is live. The response will come whether you're here or not. And that little girl left the light on. I thought you said I needed to be here for crisis management. I was wrong. This isn't the kind of crisis you manage from an office. This is the kind you survive by remembering what you're fighting for." Victoria gathered her things, wondering when Patricia had stopped being just an HR director and started being the voice of wisdom. Victoria didn't know she needed. She took the elevator down, walked out into the Manhattan night that had grown colder while she'd been inside, and told her driver to take her back to the Bronx. The drive felt shorter this time. Or maybe Victoria was just more certain about where she was going, what she was choosing, who she was fighting for. Daniel's building appeared too quickly, the porch light still burning like Maya had promised. Victoria climbed the stairs for the second time that night. Daniel opened the door before she could knock, still in his Howard t-shirt, his eyes reflecting exhaustion and relief and something that looked like hope. "I thought you'd be at the office until 3 in the morning. Patricia sent me home. Said some crises require different management." Daniel pulled her inside, into his arms, into the apartment that smelled like home, even though she'd only been there a few hours ago. They stood in the doorway holding each other while the city hummed beyond the windows, and Maya slept in the next room, and the internet exploded with reactions to Victoria's statement. "The board meeting is in 4 days, Daniel murmured into her hair. "I know. Mitchell is going to use that statement against you. He's going to say you're emotionally compromised, that you're letting personal feelings override business judgment." "Let him. I'm done pretending that loving you is a weakness instead of the truest thing I've ever chosen." Daniel pulled back enough to look at her face, searching for doubt or hesitation or the careful calculation she usually brought to major decisions. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he smiled. The real smile, not the careful one he used in public. "You're sure? Because there's no taking it back now. You just told the world that I matter more than protecting yourself. I told the world that integrity matters more than appearances, that doing the right thing counts for something, that I'm ready to prove we have nothing to hide." Victoria paused. "And yes, I told the world you matter, because you do. You and Maya both, more than I knew was possible before I met you." Daniel kissed her then, deep and certain, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise instead of a question. When they broke apart, Maya was standing in her doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You came back," Maya observed, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had proven accurate. "I came back," Victoria confirmed. "I'll always come back." Maya considered this, processing it with the seriousness she brought to her science projects and her questions about the universe. Then she crossed to where Daniel and Victoria stood, wrapping her arms around both of them in a hug that felt like faith made tangible. "Good. Because family doesn't leave. even when things are hard. Victoria felt something break open in her chest, some final wall she'd been maintaining between the life she'd planned and the life she was living. She'd spent years building a company on the principle that integrity mattered. Now she was learning that integrity applied to personal choices too, that loving Daniel and showing up for Maya wasn't a distraction from her purpose, but an extension of it. 4 days until the board meeting. 4 days until Mitchell Thornton forced a choice he assumed she wouldn't make. 4 days to prove that love and leadership weren't mutually exclusive, that choosing both wasn't naive, but necessary. The next 2 days turned into a nightmare. Day 2. TechCrunch article went viral by 8 a.m. Victoria's phone exploded. Board members, investors, clients all demanding answers. She fielded calls until midnight, missing Maya's bedtime entirely. Daniel's text at 9 p.m. Maya asked why you didn't come. I told her you're fighting for us. She said to tell you she loves you anyway. Victoria stared at that message until the screen blurred. Day 3. 2 major clients called, not to cancel, to ask for reassurance about leadership stability. 4 hours of her life spent soothing nervous executives who'd never questioned a male CEO's personal life. At Reyes Creative, Daniel overheard whispers in the break room. 2 designers, voices deliberately low. Think she'll survive the board meeting? Depends if she's willing to dump him to save the company. Daniel walked past like he hadn't heard, but his jaw stayed tight all afternoon. That evening, Victoria finally made it to the Bronx by 8 p.m. Maya was already asleep. Daniel had wine poured, waiting. We need to talk about what happens if you lose, he said quietly. Victoria sat heavily on the couch. I won't lose. But if you do, if the board votes no confidence, if Mitchell actually wins, what then? Victoria took his hand. Then I start over, build something new, with you and Maya. Daniel's eyes searched hers. You'd really give up Reyes Creative? I'd give up the company before I'd give up you. I know that now. Daniel kissed her. Deep, certain, believing. I needed to hear you say it. But I'm not planning to lose, Victoria added, steel creeping back into her voice. We're walking into that boardroom and we're winning. At 11 p.m., Patricia called. I just heard from Richard Thornton. Mitchell's been calling board members individually all week. He told Richard he has one final piece of evidence that will, quote, change everything. Victoria's blood went cold. What evidence? We've documented everything. We're clean. He won't say, but Richard says Mitchell sounded confident, too confident. After hanging up, Victoria couldn't sleep. She lay beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, mind racing through every decision she'd made in the past 6 months. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. 1 sentence. Ask Daniel about the severance offer I made him 2 weeks ago. See if he's been completely honest with you. Victoria stared at the screen, then at Daniel, sleeping peacefully beside her. A severance offer? 2 weeks ago? She didn't wake him, didn't ask, not yet. But tomorrow, today, in that boardroom, Mitchell would ask. And if Daniel had kept secrets, even small ones, everything they'd built could crumble on that omission. 16 hours until the board meeting. Victoria still wasn't sure they were ready. The Reyes Creative boardroom occupied the 40th floor of a building that had been designed to intimidate. All glass and steel and views that stretched across Manhattan like a promise that power was worth the climb. Victoria stood at the head of the table 15 minutes before the board members were scheduled to arrive. Her charcoal suit perfectly tailored, her hair pulled back in the severe bun she wore when she needed armor more than style. Patricia sat to her right, laptop open, folders arranged with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered when you were defending the indefensible. Daniel should have been there. As chief creative officer, he had standing to attend board meetings, but they'd agreed his presence would be strategic liability, would feed every assumption about inappropriate influence and compromised judgment. So he was waiting in her office 3 floors down, reviewing the independent audit results they'd commissioned 72 hours ago when Victoria's statement had hit the internet, and the response had been immediate and brutal. The TechCrunch article had gone live within an hour of her announcement. Mitchell's leaked information packaged with enough innuendo to make the SEC inquiry sound like the tip of a corruption iceberg. But Victoria's radical transparency had done something Mitchell hadn't anticipated. It had shifted the narrative from CEO under investigation to woman refuses to apologize for loving someone. The responses had split predictably along fault lines that said more about the responders than about Victoria's actual choices. Think pieces about whether workplace romances could ever be truly consensual when power imbalances existed. Counter pieces arguing that denying women the right to personal relationships was just patriarchy dressed up as protection. Twitter wars between people who'd never met Victoria or Daniel but had strong opinions about whether their relationship represented progress or cautionary tale. And through it all, the numbers. Reyes Creative's stock had dropped 3% in 2 days. 2 clients had called requesting reassurance that leadership instability wouldn't affect project timelines. 17 employees had reached out to HR asking about succession planning, but 423 people had submitted applications to work at Reyes Creative in the past 72 hours, citing Victoria's statement as proof they wanted to work for a company that valued authenticity over optics. The elevator chimed. Richard Thornton, Mitchell's older brother and the board's chairman, stepped into the hallway, his silver hair and custom suit broadcasting old money and older attitudes. He'd voted to support Victoria 3 months ago when Mitchell had forced the choice, but his support had been tactical rather than enthusiastic, preserving his position while his brother burned bridges. Now Richard's expression suggested he was reconsidering that calculation. Victoria. Patricia. I trust you're prepared to explain the statement you released without board consultation? Victoria didn't flinch. I'm prepared to defend every word, and to present evidence that contradicts the narrative Mitchell has been building. Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his brother. Family loyalty ran deep, even when that family member was actively trying to destroy what you'd help build. Mitchell isn't on this board anymore. Whatever grievances he has are separate from our fiduciary responsibilities. Are they? Because the SEC inquiry he leaked, the anonymous harassment campaign he's been running, the strategic timing of negative press, all of that serves his interests while masking as legitimate concern. The elevator chimed again. Susan Park emerged, the venture capitalist who'd invested in Reyes Creative's Series B funding and had proven herself Victoria's most consistent ally. She nodded to Victoria with an expression that conveyed solidarity without promising votes she might not be able to deliver. Next came David Chen, the cybersecurity expert who'd joined the board 18 months ago and generally voted with whoever seemed most likely to protect shareholder value. Then Marcus Webb, the retired advertising executive who'd known Victoria's father and seemed to view board service as charity work rather than actual governance. The final member was Jennifer Walsh, 38, and representing a newer generation of tech investors who'd made their fortunes in startups that actually changed industries instead of just claiming to. Jennifer had been vocal about supporting Victoria's relationship with Daniel, but she'd also been clear that support didn't extend to tolerating anything that jeopardized company performance. 5 board members. Victoria needed 3 votes to maintain control. She had Susan reliably. Jennifer, probably. Richard was the swing vote that would determine whether the next hour ended with her still leading the company she'd built or updating her LinkedIn profile. Everyone settled into their chairs. Patricia distributed packets containing the independent audit results, financial performance metrics from the past quarter, and a timeline documenting Mitchell's harassment campaign with timestamps and IP addresses that made it clear this wasn't paranoia, but provable fact. Richard opened his packet, scanning the first page with the expression of someone who'd already decided what he believed and was looking for evidence to support it rather than challenge it. Let's begin with the SEC inquiry. Victoria, what's the status? We've provided everything they requested. hiring records, promotion criteria, compensation data, performance reviews. Our outside counsel believes they're conducting due diligence rather than pursuing charges, but we won't have final word for another 3 weeks. David leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that telegraphed nervous energy. 3 weeks of uncertainty. 3 weeks of clients questioning our stability. 3 weeks of this story dominating every industry publication. 3 weeks of proving we have nothing to hide, Victoria countered. The audit results Patricia distributed show that every hire and promotion I've approved in the past 3 years met or exceeded our established criteria. Daniel's metrics are actually higher than average for his position. Jennifer was reading the audit results with the focus of someone who actually understood statistical analysis. His revenue generation is 42% above the Chief Creative Officer benchmark. Client satisfaction scores are 93%, which is exceptional. Time to project completion is 15% faster than his predecessor. None of which matters if the appearance of impropriety damages our reputation, Marcus observed, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who believed age conferred wisdom instead of just calcification of outdated thinking. Susan closed her packet deliberately. I've read the audit, I've reviewed Daniel's work, I've looked at the numbers, and what I see is a CEO who made a difficult personal choice and refused to compromise her professional standards to make that choice more palatable to people uncomfortable with women in power having personal lives. Richard's expression hardened. Susan, this isn't about gender politics, isn't it? Because I don't recall this board convening an emergency meeting when Tom Harrison was dating his executive assistant. I don't remember demanding audits when James Liu married someone from his sales team. But a female CEO dates a male employee she hired, and suddenly we're questioning everything she's ever decided. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. David found something fascinating about his folder. Even Richard had the grace to look away. Victoria let the moment breathe before speaking. I'm not asking you to approve of my relationship with Daniel. I'm asking you to judge my leadership based on results. Revenue is up 18%, year over year. Employee retention is at 94%. We've landed 3 Fortune 100 clients in the past 6 months. Client satisfaction is the highest it's been in company history. And the stock price? Richard challenged. Down 3% since your statement. Shareholder value matters, Victoria. Patricia pulled up a presentation on the screen at the end of the table. The first slide showed Reyes Creative's stock performance overlaid with industry averages and competitor data. The 3% decline happened across the entire tech sector this week. Market volatility related to Federal Reserve policy announcements. If you isolate our performance from the broader market trends, we're actually up 0.7%. Jennifer nodded, making notes. I saw that. The decline isn't company-specific. It's macro-level movement that's hitting everyone. But the perception, Marcus began. The perception is that a female CEO had the audacity to fall in love and refuse to apologize for it, Susan interrupted. And yes, that makes some people uncomfortable. But uncomfortable isn't the same as wrong, and our job as a board is to evaluate leadership based on performance, not on whether their personal choices conform to outdated norms about who women in power are allowed to love. Victoria pulled out the final piece of evidence she'd been saving, the document that Patricia had compiled after 3 sleepless nights of digital forensics. This is a comprehensive timeline of every anonymous attack, every negative article, every social media campaign targeting my relationship with Daniel. The highlighted sections trace back to 3 IP addresses. 2 are VPN services that route through anonymizers, but the third originates from an office building in Soho, where Mitchell maintains his new agency. She slid the document across the table to Richard, whose face went carefully blank as he read. My brother may have opinions about your choices, but that doesn't constitute a conspiracy. It does when those opinions are being weaponized through coordinated misinformation campaigns designed to tank our stock price and destabilize our leadership. Victoria's voice remained level, professional, cold as the glass walls surrounding them. Mitchell lost 2 major clients to us in the past year. Clients who explicitly cited Daniel's work as superior to what they were getting from Mitchell's team. This isn't about protecting the company. It's about a man who can't handle being outcompeted by the woman who rejected him and the black designer who's better at the job. The racial element hung in the air, unspoken until now. The truth everyone had been carefully avoiding, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that maybe the scrutiny wasn't just about workplace romance, but about who was allowed to succeed and who was supposed to stay in their assigned place. Jennifer spoke first, her voice measured but firm. I've been reviewing social media analytics. A significant portion of the negative commentary about Daniel includes coded language about diversity hires and affirmative action. The attacks aren't just questioning Victoria's judgment. They're questioning whether Daniel belongs in leadership at all. David shifted again, looking even more uncomfortable. Are we suggesting that criticism of this relationship is racially motivated? I'm suggesting that we need to look at the pattern, Jennifer replied. When a talented black designer gets promoted based on exceptional performance, and the response is to question whether he earned it, that's not healthy skepticism. That's prejudice dressed up as concern. Marcus cleared his throat. This is getting far afield from our actual governance responsibilities. No. This is exactly our governance responsibility. Susan's tone left no room for deflection. We're responsible for protecting this company from threats, internal and external. Mitchell Thornton is an external threat conducting a coordinated attack designed to force Victoria into an impossible choice. And some of the internal threats are the unconscious biases that make us question a black man's qualifications more stringently than we'd question a white man with identical credentials. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, but close enough to make Victoria's pulse quicken with hope. Richard cleared his throat, interrupting the discussion. Before we proceed to a vote, I need to address one more item. Victoria's stomach dropped. This morning, my brother sent me what he calls his final evidence. He claims that 2 weeks ago he personally contacted Daniel Brooks and offered him a severance package, $150,000 cash plus a reference letter, to quietly resign and, quote, make things easier for Victoria. Richard looked directly at her. Mitchell alleges that Daniel never disclosed this offer to you. The room fell silent. Victoria felt every eye on her. Is this true? Marcus Webb asked, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind. Victoria pulled out her phone with shaking hands, dialed Daniel's number on speaker. Patricia had arranged for him to be available during the meeting. Daniel, I'm in the board meeting. I need you to answer a question honestly, on the record. Of course. His voice came through clear and steady. Did Mitchell Thornton contact you 2 weeks ago and offer you money to resign? Silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then, yes, he did. Audible gasps around the table. David Chen leaned back, arms crossed. Marcus shook his head. And you didn't tell Victoria about this offer? Susan Park asked. Her voice sharp with something that might have been disappointment. No, I didn't tell him. Daniel's voice remained calm. Mitchell called my personal cell at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, said he was calling as a friend, offered me $150,000 plus a glowing reference letter if I'd resign within the week, said it would, quote, make things easier for Victoria if I just walked away before the board meeting. And what did you say? Richard pressed. I told him to go to hell, then I hung up. Victoria's eyes stung, but she kept her face neutral. Mr. Brooks, Jennifer Walsh leaned forward. Why didn't you disclose this to Ms. Reyes? Surely you understood it was relevant. Because I didn't want Victoria to think for 1 second that I was staying for the wrong reasons. Daniel's voice carried quiet intensity. I wanted her to know, to be absolutely certain, that I chose her, not that I chose against money, that my decision to be with her had nothing to do with financial incentives or professional calculations. It was about love. Period. He paused. Maybe that was the wrong call. Maybe I should have told her. But I made a choice to prove my integrity through actions, not words. I turned down $150,000 because money is worthless compared to what Victoria and Maya mean to me. Susan Park's expression shifted. So Mitchell attempted to bribe you to leave, and when you refused, he's now weaponizing your discretion as evidence of dishonesty. That's what it sounds like, Daniel confirmed. Jennifer started making notes. Richard, with all due respect to your brother, this isn't a scandal. This is proof of Mr. Brooks' integrity. He refused a substantial payout to stay with Victoria. How exactly is that damaging? Richard looked down at his phone, at whatever message Mitchell had sent. It's not. My brother overplayed his hand. Victoria pressed the phone closer. Daniel, thank you for telling the truth. Always, he replied quietly. I'll see you at Maya's science fair at 3 o'clock. The line clicked off. Susan turned to Richard. I move that we proceed to the vote on Victoria's leadership. This evidence strengthens my confidence, not weakens it. That was our general counsel. The SEC just concluded their inquiry. That was our general counsel. The SEC just concluded their inquiry. No violations found. They're closing the case. The words hit the room like thunder. Patricia's fingers flew across her laptop, pulling up the official notification that had just landed in the company email. Victoria read it twice, making sure she wasn't hallucinating what she desperately wanted to see. The Securities and Exchange Commission had conducted a thorough review of Reyes Creative's hiring, promotion, and compensation practices. They'd examined Daniel's qualifications, interview records, performance metrics, and advancement timeline. They'd compared his trajectory to industry benchmarks and internal precedents, and they'd found nothing to suggest impropriety, favoritism, or violations of any securities regulations. Jennifer started clapping, slow and deliberate. Susan joined her. David looked relieved enough to applaud simply because the problem was resolving itself. Marcus remained still, his expression suggesting he'd bet on the wrong horse and was recalculating his position. Richard was reading his phone again, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. Mitchell just texted me. He says the SEC closing the inquiry doesn't prove anything except that government investigations are politically motivated. Of course he does, Victoria observed, because admitting that Daniel earned his position requires admitting that Mitchell's entire campaign was based on prejudice rather than legitimate concern. He's my brother. And I'm the CEO who built this company while he was still trading on your family name. You need to decide which loyalty matters more, blood or fiduciary responsibility. The challenge hung between them, forcing Richard to confront the calculation he'd been avoiding for 3 months. His brother or his board seat, family or integrity. The comfortable narrative that powerful women who loved the wrong men deserved what they got, or the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the system attacked people for refusing to play by rules designed to keep them small. Richard set down his phone with deliberate care. I move that we vote to reaffirm our confidence in Victoria Reyes as CEO of Reyes Creative Agency, and that we formally distance the board from any statements or actions taken by former board member Mitchell Thornton. Victoria's breath caught. Susan seconded immediately. Jennifer nodded her support. David hesitated, then raised his hand. I support the motion. Marcus sat frozen, the last vote that would make it unanimous or leave a crack that Mitchell could exploit. Marcus, Susan pressed, you've known Victoria since she was designing websites in her father's apartment. You've watched her build this company from nothing. You know who she is. Marcus's weathered face worked through emotions that probably started with discomfort and ended somewhere near shame. I vote to support. But Victoria, I hope you understand that this has been difficult. For some of us who come from a different generation. Difficult how? Difficult to accept that I can love someone and lead a company? or difficult to accept that the someone I love doesn't look like your son-in-law?" The bluntness made Marcus flinch, but Victoria was done with careful language that let people hide behind euphemism. "Both, if I'm being honest, but my discomfort doesn't override your right to live your life, so you have my vote." It wasn't a ringing endorsement. It was the bare minimum of human decency dressed up as progressive thinking. But it was unanimous, and that mattered in a boardroom where votes determined futures. Richard's voice was formal as he recorded the decision. "The motion passes. Victoria Reyes is reaffirmed as CEO with full board confidence. Patricia, please draft a statement to that effect for release within the hour." Patricia was already typing, her fingers moving with the speed of someone who'd prepared 3 versions of this outcome and just needed to select the right one. "There's one more item," Victoria announced, and the board members who'd been gathering their things paused. She pulled out a final folder, this one containing the proposal she and Daniel had developed over the past 4 days, while the internet raged and Mitchell plotted and the future hung uncertain. "I'm proposing we formalize a company-wide initiative focused on equitable hiring and advancement. Blind resume reviews, standardized interview protocols, regular audits of promotion patterns to identify unconscious bias, annual training on inclusive leadership." Jennifer was already reading the proposal, nodding with each page. "This is comprehensive, and it addresses every concern that's been raised about whether our hiring practices favor any particular demographic. It also positions us as industry leaders in equitable practices," Susan added. "We're not just defending Victoria's choice, we're using this moment to improve our systems." "The cost?" Richard asked, because of course the cost mattered more than the principle. $80,000 for the first year. Includes third-party auditing, training development, and system implementation. After that, approximately $20,000 annually for ongoing review and updates. David was running numbers on his tablet. "That's manageable. And if it prevents future controversies or demonstrates our commitment to equitable practices, it's probably a net positive for recruitment and retention." Marcus shifted again. "So we're admitting there was a problem with our hiring?" "We're admitting there's always room for improvement," Victoria corrected, "and that what happened to Daniel, having his qualifications questioned because of who he loves and what he looks like, shouldn't happen to the next talented person who doesn't fit someone's narrow definition of what leadership looks like." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones, less hostile and more contemplative. Even Marcus seemed to be processing something that had penetrated whatever defenses he'd built against change. "I move to approve the Equitable Hiring Initiative," Jennifer stated, "with the understanding that we'll review outcomes quarterly and adjust as needed." The vote was unanimous again, though Marcus's support came several seconds after everyone else's, like he was still catching up to where the world had moved while he'd been standing still. The meeting adjourned. Board members filed out with varying degrees of enthusiasm about what had just transpired. Richard paused at the door, turning back to face Victoria with an expression that might have been respect if he'd known how to show it clearly. "My brother isn't going to stop. Closing the SEC inquiry and getting board support doesn't eliminate him as a threat." "I know. But now he's acting alone instead of with institutional backing. That changes the calculation." Richard nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. Not in your professional judgment. Your results speak for themselves. But in believing that you can have both the corner office and the complicated personal life without one eventually destroying the other. Then I guess we'll find out together, because I'm not giving up either one." Richard left without responding. Victoria waited until she was alone with Patricia before allowing herself to breathe fully, to feel the weight of the past hour settle into her bones. "We won," Patricia observed, packing up her laptop with movements that suggested she was still processing the outcome. "We survived. That's different from winning. The board reaffirmed you. The SEC cleared you. Mitchell's campaign just lost most of its teeth." Victoria walked to the windows, looking out over Manhattan at the city that had given her everything and asked for most of it back. Somewhere down there, Daniel was waiting to hear whether their relationship had just cost her the company she'd built. Somewhere down there, Maya was at school learning fractions and probably still working on her science project about why people judged love. Somewhere down there, Mitchell Thornton was realizing that his carefully orchestrated campaign had failed, and people who failed spectacularly in public rarely retreated gracefully. Call Daniel. Tell him to meet me at the office. And Patricia? Her HR director looked up from her packing. Thank you for believing that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting ourselves from the consequences. Patricia's smile was tired but genuine. I spent 20 years at a corporate law firm defending companies from the results of their own discrimination. When you offered me this job, you promised I could help build something different. Today, we proved that promise wasn't empty. The next afternoon, Victoria arrived at PS 142 Elementary School at 2:55 p.m., breathless from sprinting 3 blocks when her Uber got stuck in crosstown traffic. Daniel was already there, standing in front of Maya's tri-fold presentation board with the expression of a father who'd never been prouder. The display board read in bold letters, "Why do people judge love? A scientific study by Maya Brooks, age 8. Survey results covered the board in neat rows. 50 total participants, 30 children, ages 8 to 10, 20 adults. Question 1. Is it wrong for people from different races to fall in love? Children. 98% answered, no, love is love. 2% answered, I don't know. Adults. 77% had answered, no, it's acceptable. 23% answered, it's problematic. Question 2. Is it wrong for a boss to date an employee? Children. 95% answered, I don't know what that means. 5% answered no. Adults. 61% answered, yes, it's problematic. 39% answered, it depends on the situation. Maya's conclusion. Written in purple crayon. Kids don't care about race until grown-ups teach them to care. Love should be simple. Adults make it complicated. Mrs. Rodriguez called Maya to the front to present. Maya stood at her board, small hands clasped together, nervous energy radiating off her. Then she spotted Victoria and Daniel sitting together in the front row. Her gap-toothed smile burst across her face like sunrise. Hi everyone, I'm Maya Brooks, and I did this project because people on the internet say really mean things about my daddy and Tori. I wanted to test if the mean things were based on science or just based on feelings. Victoria's throat tightened. Daniel reached over, squeezed her hand. So I made a survey and I asked my whole class and some people at church and some of my daddy's friends at work. And what I found out is that kids my age don't think it's weird at all when people look different from each other or work different jobs. But grown-ups do think it's weird. A parent in the back, white man, probably mid-50s, raised his hand. So what's your solution to this problem, Maya? Maya looked directly at him, fearless. Stop teaching kids to judge people for things that don't matter. Teach them to judge people for being kind instead. My daddy is kind, Tori is kind. They love each other and they make each other happy. That's all the science you really need. The cafeteria erupted in applause. Victoria noticed several parents wiping their eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez was beaming. The district science coordinator, a middle school teacher serving as judge, stepped forward. First place in the 3rd grade science division goes to Maya Brooks for demonstrating excellent research methodology and drawing meaningful conclusions from her data. Maya shrieked with joy. Daniel lifted her up, spinning her around while she clutched the blue ribbon like it was made of solid gold. Victoria was crying openly and didn't care who saw. When Daniel set Maya down, she ran to Victoria. Did I do good? Did I help Daddy? Victoria pulled her into a fierce hug. You helped everyone, baby girl. You reminded us all what actually matters. And I proved it with science, Maya added, gap-toothed grin incandescent. That night, after celebrating with ice cream and letting Maya stay up an hour past bedtime, Daniel tucked her into bed. Maya carefully taped the blue ribbon to the wall above her headboard, positioning it right next to the framed photo of Sarah. "Mommy would be so proud of you," Daniel whispered, voice thick. Maya smiled, already half asleep. "I know. I asked her to help me with my project. I think she sent me Tori to give me data." Daniel kissed her forehead, too overcome to speak. In the doorway, Victoria watched them both. This family that had chosen her as much as she'd chosen them. Victoria descended to her office on the 22nd floor, her heels clicking against marble with a rhythm that felt like victory or relief, or maybe just exhaustion. Daniel was already there, standing at her window with the same view she'd just left 40 floors higher, his reflection in the glass showing more tension than his posture suggested. The SEC closed the inquiry. No violations found. Daniel turned, his expression cycling through disbelief and hope, and something that looked like the first deep breath he'd taken in 72 hours. And the board? Unanimous vote of confidence. Richard's drafting a statement of support. We're implementing company-wide equity initiatives. Mitchell's campaign just imploded. Daniel closed the distance between them in 3 strides, pulling her into an embrace that felt less like celebration and more like two people who'd been holding their breath underwater, finally breaking the surface. "I was so sure they'd force you to choose," Daniel admitted, his voice muffled against her hair. "I had a resignation letter drafted in case you needed an easy way out." Victoria pulled back sharply. "You what?" "I wasn't going to let you sacrifice your company for me. If the board had demanded it, I was going to resign before they could force your hand." "That's not your choice to make." "It's exactly my choice. You built Ray as creative. You employed 180 people. You changed an industry. I wasn't going to let a relationship destroy that, even if the relationship was the best thing that ever happened to me." Victoria wanted to be angry at his presumption, his willingness to make unilateral decisions about their future. But she understood the impulse too well because she'd been running the same calculation. What she'd sacrifice to protect him. How much of herself she'd give up to make sure Maya didn't lose another person she'd started counting as family. "We don't get to make those choices for each other anymore. If we're doing this, really doing this, then we decide together what we're willing to fight for and what we're willing to lose." Daniel's thumb brushed across her cheekbone in a gesture that had become familiar over 3 months of learning each other's tells and comfort languages. "So what did we fight for, and what are we going to lose?" Victoria's phone buzzed. Patricia, with the drafted board statement that needed final approval before it went live. Another text from an unknown number, another message she'd delete without reading because Mitchell's defeat didn't mean he'd disappeared, just that he'd need to recalibrate his attack. "We fought for the right to be both competent and human, to make decisions based on merit without apologizing for also making decisions based on love, to lead a company without pretending we don't have hearts that want impossible things. And what did we lose?" Victoria thought about Marcus's uncomfortable vote, about the 3% stock decline that wasn't really about them but would be forever associated with their story, about the employees who'd asked about succession planning because they'd learned that loving visibly came with consequences. Privacy, the benefit of the doubt, the luxury of making mistakes without them being interpreted as proof that women in power can't handle personal relationships. She paused. "But we gained something too. We gained proof that integrity isn't just a value we claim, it's a price we're willing to pay." Daniel's kiss tasted like relief and residual fear, and the kind of hope that comes from surviving something you weren't sure was survivable. When the moment broke apart, Victoria's phone was ringing with a number she recognized. The New York Times, probably wanting comment on the board's decision and the SEC closure, and the broader implications of a female CEO refusing to choose between ambition and romance. She declined the call. There would be time for interviews and statements and the careful construction of narrative. Right now, she needed to call Maya's school and confirm she'd be there for the science fair presentation tomorrow. Needed to show up for the 8-year-old who'd left the porch light on and believed family meant everyone took care of everyone. Maya's science fair is tomorrow, Victoria reminded him. 3 o'clock. I promised I'd be there. Daniel pulled out his phone, checking the calendar that governed their increasingly intertwined lives. I'm presenting to the Greenleaf team at 2. Should be done by 2:45 if they don't run over. And if they do, then I tell them I have a prior commitment to an 8-year-old scientist who's more important than their packaging redesign. They'll understand or they won't, but either way, I'm leaving at 2:45. Victoria felt something settle in her chest, some final confirmation that they were building this thing correctly, that choosing each other didn't mean sacrificing everything else, but rather reorganizing priorities to make room for what actually mattered. Her phone rang again. This time, it was a number she couldn't ignore. Angela Brooks, Daniel's mother, who'd been silent through most of the past 3 months, but whose opinion mattered more than any board members, because Maya listened when Grandma talked and Daniel still sought approval from the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. I should take this, Victoria murmured, already dreading the conversation, because mothers who'd spent decades protecting their sons rarely welcomed the women who threatened to complicate that protection. She answered, stepping away from Daniel to give herself space for whatever was coming. Ms. Reyes, this is Angela Brooks. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. The formal address stung more than hostility would have. Victoria had met Angela twice, once at the hospital after her eye surgery, once at Daniel's apartment for Sunday dinner. Both times had been cordial but carefully distant, Angela assessing whether this CEO dating her son was temporary distraction or permanent complication. Mrs. Brooks, please call me Victoria, and now is fine. How are you? I'm well, thank you. I'm calling because I saw the news about the SEC inquiry closing, and about your board reaffirming their confidence in you. Victoria waited, knowing that whatever came next would reveal whether she'd gained an ally or confirmed an enemy. I wanted to say thank you. The words were so unexpected that Victoria needed a moment to process them. Thank you? Angela's sigh carried the weight of years Victoria couldn't quite calculate. I raised Daniel alone after his father died, worked 3 jobs to keep us housed and fed, watched him grow into a man who believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him everything, because that's what his father would have wanted. Victoria's throat tightened. She could hear Daniel moving closer, trying to figure out what his mother was saying that was making Victoria's eyes well up. When he told me about you, about missing that interview to help a stranger, I thought he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I thought he'd sacrificed his future for a woman who wouldn't even remember his name. Mrs. Brooks, let me finish, please. When I met you at the hospital, I saw how you looked at him. Like he mattered. Like he wasn't just the help or the charity case or the diversity hire. Like he was a man worth knowing. Angela paused, and Victoria heard the tremor in her voice. And when I saw what you did this week, that statement, standing up to your board, refusing to apologize for loving my son, I understood that he didn't make a mistake that day in the rain. He found exactly what he was looking for. Victoria couldn't speak past the tears that were threatening to destroy her carefully maintained composure. So thank you for seeing him clearly, for fighting for him when it would have been easier to let him go, for showing Maya what it looks like when someone chooses to stay instead of leaving when things get hard. I love him, Mrs. Brooks. I love them both. More than I knew I could love anything that wasn't a business plan. Angela's laugh was warm and slightly watery. Then I guess you should call me Angela, because we're going to be family, and family doesn't do formal. The call ended. Victoria stood holding her phone like it contained something precious and fragile, trying to process that she'd just received blessing from the one person whose opinion could have derailed everything. Daniel was watching her with an expression that suggested he'd heard enough to understand what had just transpired. My mother called to give you her approval, didn't she? She called to say thank you. For seeing you clearly. For fighting for you. Daniel's composure cracked, just for a moment, just enough to reveal the man who'd spent 3 years being both parents to a daughter who needed all the love he could manufacture from grief and determination. I need to tell you something, Daniel began, his voice carrying the weight of confession. When Sarah was dying, she made me promise that I'd find someone eventually, that I'd let Maya see what healthy love looks like, that I wouldn't use her death as an excuse to stop believing in the possibility of being happy. He paused, and Victoria waited, because this felt important in ways she couldn't quite name. I told her I'd try, but I didn't believe it was possible. I thought the best I could do was survive, raise Maya, build some kind of career that would make her proud. Love felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. And now? Now I'm standing in your office 3 floors below where you just defended our relationship to a board of directors. My mother just called to give her blessing. Maya's science project is literally about whether love can survive scrutiny. And I'm terrified because I'm happier than I've been since before Sarah got sick. And happiness feels dangerous when you know how quickly it can be taken away. Victoria crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers with the same deliberateness he'd shown her the night she'd returned to his apartment instead of staying at the office. We can't promise each other that nothing will go wrong. Mitchell is still out there. The internet still has opinions. The world still thinks it has the right to judge who we love based on whether it makes them comfortable. So what can we promise? We can promise to show up. For each other. For Maya. For the life we're building that doesn't look like anyone's blueprint but somehow feels more real than anything we could have planned. Daniel pulled her close, and they stood in her office overlooking a city that had nearly broken them both, that had tested every assumption about what was possible and what was worth fighting for. Maya's science fair is tomorrow at 3, Daniel reminded her, his voice muffled against her hair. I'll be there. Front row. With the good camera and the flowers she likes even though she pretends they're embarrassing. She doesn't pretend. She genuinely thinks flowers are embarrassing, but she keeps every bouquet you've ever given her, pressed between books in her room. Victoria's heart did something complicated in her chest, some combination of joy and terror that came from being trusted with a child's carefully hidden affections. The board statement is going live in an hour. The press is going to want interviews. Mitchell is going to escalate because people who build campaigns on the assumption they'll win rarely know how to lose gracefully. But we won. We survived round 1. There will be others. Daniel's smile carried the weight of someone who'd been underestimated his entire life and had learned to transform that underestimation into fuel. Then we survive those too. Together. The word settled between them like a vow, like the foundation they'd been building since a rainy day in September when a stranger had needed help and a designer had chosen kindness over self-preservation. Victoria's phone buzzed with Patricia's message. Board statement was live. Media requests were flooding in. The stock price had already ticked up 0.5% on the news of the SEC closure and board confidence. But for now, in this moment, Victoria let the notifications wait. Let the crisis management happen without her constant supervision. Let herself be a woman who'd fought for the right to love someone and won. At least for today. At least enough to prove that integrity wasn't just an abstract value, but a lived practice that cost everything and gave back something more precious than anything money could buy. 6 months later, Brooklyn Bridge Park stretched green and golden under the October sun. Victoria sat on a checkered picnic blanket beside Daniel, watching Maya chase pigeons with the fearless joy of a child who'd won first place at the citywide science fair back in June. The second chance Creative Initiative, the equity program Victoria and Daniel had co-founded, had just graduated its first cohort last week. 23 designers from underrepresented communities, all placed in paid positions at partner agencies. 11 of them now worked at Reyes Creative. Daniel had personally mentored 6. The company had grown to 200 employees. Year-over-year revenue was up 32%. And just last week, Victoria had been named to Forbes's Most Admired CEOs list, not for her profit margins, but for proving that integrity and innovation aren't mutually exclusive. Mitchell Thornton's agency had quietly folded in August. He'd accepted a position at a consulting firm in Chicago, 3 steps down from where he'd started. Richard had sent Victoria a brief text. "My brother is finally learning humility. It's painful to watch, but probably necessary." Maya came running back, breathless and flushed. "Daddy! Tori, look what I found!" She held up a perfectly intact feather, brown and white striped. Surprisingly large, Daniel examined it carefully. "That's a hawk feather, baby girl. That's really special. You know what hawks represent?" Maya shook her head, eyes wide. Victoria smiled. "Vision. The ability to see things clearly, even from very far away." Maya considered this seriously. "Like how you could see that Daddy was good even when other people couldn't see it?" "Exactly like that." Maya carefully tucked the feather into her science journal. She carried it everywhere now, constantly collecting observations for her next project on why do birds fly in different patterns. Daniel's arm wrapped around both of them. Sarah's photo was still in his wallet, would always be there. But his heart had learned something in the past year. Love didn't replace love. It multiplied it, just like Sarah had asked him to let it in those final terrible days. "Can we live together for real now?" Maya asked suddenly, looking between them with 8-year-old directness. "Like all 3 of us in one actual house?" Victoria and Daniel had been discussing exactly this for the past month. The penthouse in the Upper East Side felt cold and empty. The 1-bedroom in the Bronx felt impossibly cramped. "We've actually been looking at houses," Daniel admitted, unable to keep the secret any longer. Maya's eyes went wide as saucers. "Really? Like a real house with a yard? And room for a proper science laboratory for you," Victoria added. "And a real studio where Daddy can do his art? And an office where Tori can work from home sometimes so she doesn't miss dinner," Daniel confirmed. Maya threw her arms around both of them with enough force to nearly knock them over. "This is even better than winning first place." Victoria kissed the top of her head, breathing in strawberry shampoo and autumn sunshine. "You know what, Maya? Your conclusion in your science project was absolutely right." "Which part?" "That love should be simple. We just had to be brave enough to keep it that way." Daniel pulled them both closer, his chin resting on Victoria's head. Behind them, the Manhattan skyline glittered in the afternoon light. The city that had tested them, challenged every assumption they'd held about what was possible, what was allowed, what was worth fighting for, and ultimately proven that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything you thought you couldn't afford to lose, was always, always worth it. Maya looked up at the sky where a hawk circled lazy and free against the October blue. "Daddy, what's bigger than the sky?" Daniel and Victoria answered in unison, voices overlapping like harmony. "Love that chooses to stay." Maya smiled her gap-toothed smile and tucked herself more firmly between them, feather still clutched in her hand, ribbon still hanging above her bed at home, and the future stretching out ahead like an adventure she couldn't wait to document in her journal.